idea of what is happening to technology.
Very aggressive.
Well, she wanted to make that point very clear. As Luna said, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Hamburg at the moment, where I focus on digital conflict experience. And this work is basically built on my PhD thesis that I did at the University of Essex, that I defended in May of last year, and that I'm now now turning into a monograph for the Routledge Research in Phenomenology Series. So I'm trying, obviously, to enhance that draft and add more details here and there, more literature, and overall restructure the text a little bit. So this is how the book will look like, hopefully, in the end. So there's 6 chapters in the book, and what I'm going to talk, or the chapters that I hope I will be talking about today, are the first 4 chapters. Most likely I will not get to the conflict space, but maybe there's some time that I can elaborate on that a little bit. So first of all, let me talk a little bit about, so I come from analytic political philosophy. I was trained in analytic political philosophy, and then I turned to phenomenology, and I will try to give you reasons now for why that is. Right? Especially when we talk about political conflict. So I think political conflict is something that should interest us, not only for theoretical reasons, but for very practical reasons. You see in the background here on the slide, the January 6th insurrection attempt, and left at an attempt in 2021. And so we, on the one side, have political conflict as a phenomenon that is very mundane, that we encounter on a daily basis. Basically, everyone who is engaging with others will at some point or another engage in political conflict with others. But as January 6th and other developments, basically in all liberal democracies show at the moment, political conflict seems to become a prime phenomenon of our time, and especially in its increasingly violent form. Think of the assassination attempt that Donald Trump in the past weeks and months. Look at the riots happening in the UK a couple of weeks ago here. Look at the Alternative for Germany, as they call themselves, the radical right-wing party in Germany that is now the strongest party in the Parliament of Thuringia, I think. Thuringia, what is the English word for it? So Marine Le Pen in France, Meloni in Italy, we can go on, right? So not only are these times that are very polarized and very fragmented, and where liberal democracies seem to tend to the extremes now, but also these are very conflictual times. And so we should, in my eyes, engage with that phenomenon in political philosophy. Interestingly enough, there is not really a clearly outlined discourse of a philosophy of conflict in political philosophy or political theory. There is an epistemology of a disagreement, and I'm happy to talk about why what I'm doing is not epistemology of disagreement later on in the Q&A. Epistemology of disagreement is also being now employed by some political theorists, but there's not really a systematic interest of political philosophy in investigating conflict vis-à-vis disagreement. However, if you look a little bit more closely at contemporary political theories, then you can kind of read between the lines. Some of them are more explicit about it, but most of them are kind of implicit about it. What kinds of approaches to political conflict are in stock. And that is basically what I'm doing in the first chapter of my book, mapping this debate. And those 4 camps that I identify there are the utopians, the conflict realists, the conflict totalizers, for lack of a better word. If you find a better word for it, please let me know, and the conflict managers. So let me go briefly through each of them in turn. So the conflict utopians, represented by I think the most paradigmatic political philosopher still to this day, John Rawls, but also someone like Jürgen Habermas, generally deliberative democratic theory, I would say, operates from the realm of ideal theory to formulate solutions to conflict. And what is ideal theory? Ideal theory basically means in political philosophy that there's an idealized state of affairs envisioned, be it the original position in Rawls or the well-ordered society in Rawls, ideal speech situation in Habermas, I think, as well. And from within these idealized state of affairs, certain kinds of normative principles are formulated that are then supposed to guide us in the real world. So what are some of these idealizing assumptions that are being made? One of them is that conflicts are only, or the conflicts that we focus on are really only conflicts among reasonable or rational citizens. And what that then means is oftentimes varies, but is oftentimes heavily morally charged what reasonableness in a citizen means, what a rational citizen is. Unreasonable citizens are then, as Rawls puts it, to be contained like war or disease, he says literally. So what we have is basically a sanitized political arena where reasonable citizens only put forth reasons, they're called public reasons or political reasons that everyone can share. So they are by virtue reasons that everybody who is reasonable can in principle share. And under these conditions, conflict is fully resolvable via consensus. So consensus means here unanimous agreement. Nobody really loses anything because we all agree that there's because of better, like the unforced force of the better argument, I think, how I must put it that way, that we can agree this is the best potential policy that we should pursue, or the best solution, and therefore conflict can in principle be a matter of the past, or when it comes about every once in a while in a world order society, we can nonetheless resolve it again. We can appease situations on the go. The primary value, and that is really something about these theories, they tend to focus on other things other than conflict. The primary value that they want to institute, the conflict utopians, is justice, social justice, right? Rawls is justice as fairness, for example. Okay, the second camp are the conflict realists, someone like Judith Shklar, Bernard Williams, John Horton, that write their approaches often as a critical response exactly towards these kind of conflict utopians or these ideal theorists, as I just discussed. They purport that they are entirely non-utopian, so they work not in ideal theory, but non-ideal theory, so they attempt to work from the reality of politics as it is experienced and practiced, as John Horton puts it. And that includes taking into account how power stratifies the political arena. And basically include that in a description, claiming that their description of politics is therefore more adequate, which then also leads to more adequate normative solutions. They therefore also agree that conflict is ineradicable. We cannot get rid of conflict in the way that the conflict utopians think we can. And we can therefore also not attain full justice. Justice is something where we have to make some sort of compromise. What we can achieve, and that is something that Bernard Williams makes very strong in his, in the beginning was the deed, I think 2005, where he says, well, the primary value for politics is actually that we establish order, that we establish stability or peace or what have you, because otherwise we have a war of each and everyone against the other. And therefore, bringing about order, how to bring about order is the first political question anyway. It's the prime question of politics. And only then can we think about other questions or attempt to answer other questions. So instead of consensus and justice, what we have is more something like compromise, and compromise to uphold the order, the status quo, so that we are not completely overtaken by chaos. Then we have the conflict totalizers, and they are represented especially by Chantal Mouffe, and they are very close to the conflict realists in many ways. But what they do differently than the conflict realists is that they ontologize conflicts. They make conflict the ontological condition for the possibility of having politics in the first place. And they do that in the sense of the antagonistic dimension, as they call it. So this difference between friend and foe, us versus them, is basically the ontological condition, meaning that it is only because we identify with others and against others, especially against others, that we, through that conflict of insider versus outsider, we bring about certain sets of political institutions, certain political practices, policies, and so on. So everyday politics wouldn't even exist without that conflictual dimension. And the goals here are also, again, very similar to the conflict realists. So what we need is to kind of contain that antagonistic dimension so that it doesn't realize itself as a full-blown antagonism where we destroy one another, but we try to channel it into a healthy agonism of some sort of fair competition amongst the groups for hegemony of power. And again, what is needed is stability and order and a very thin consensus on ethico-political values. What thin means here is that we can all have very different conceptions of what freedom is supposed to mean and what equality or democracy are supposed to mean, but there should be a consensus that these are nonetheless important for politics or nonetheless important for democracy. But then we will have very different, that comes also about through the discourse analytic or discourse theoretical approach by Mouffe and Laclau. What that then means can vary very much from one group to the other. And then finally, we have the conflict managers. And I think that we can kind of map the conflict managers onto the other approaches, but I will nonetheless list it here as well. I think at the moment represented by Emanuel Echeva mainly and even maybe only, which is an approach that considers itself complementary to conflict utopianism and conflict realism, where it is not an end-state approach, as Echeva calls it. So conflict realists and conflict utopians are interested in what happens after a conflict. Do we achieve justice or do we achieve peace or stability, right? And Emanuel Echeva is more interested in the kind of quality of the interaction that unfolds within the conflict itself. So what she wants is that she highlights that citizens have an inherent dignity and deserve equal respect to a certain extent. And therefore, what we need is to shift antagonistic conflict dynamics in very intractable kinds of conflicts towards cooperative conflict dynamics where this kind of respect and dignity occur. And the primary value that is then supposed to be instantiated is not end-state justice like social justice in a Rawlsian register, for example, but interactive justice, as she calls it. Again, I think because Rawls and Habermas and deliberative democratic theorists, by virtue of them being deliberative democratic theorists, already focus highly on that procedural aspect. But nonetheless, maybe that is the fourth approach. Okay, so why do I say all of that? So the problem with all of these approaches, right, is that virtually all of them agree that conflict is a central political phenomenon, but they rarely offer any explicit definitions or typologies for that. There are a couple of exceptions. Rawls on one page, or if you include the same thing that he writes in the introduction to political liberalism on 2 pages, gives a bit of a typology of conflict, and then never talks about it again. Carlo Burelli has a recent paper out about political realism, which is kind of similar, convergent with conflict realism, where he has 1 page about what is conflict, or like 2 lines about what is conflict. The same for Emanuel Echeva on what value conflict is, so a particular kind of conflict, but she doesn't say what is conflict in general. And often these notions are borrowed from neighboring disciplines, so sociology, political science, psychology, peace and conflict studies, obviously, what have you. But the question remains if philosophy, by way of its own resource, can actually contribute anything to that debate. And we see a similar issue mirrored in empirical political science and adjacent disciplines such as political psychology and political communication, that there are often empirical studies where it is obvious because they use the concept of conflict, or they use something similar like disagreement. There is some sort of conception operative, but then they never really make it, or oftentimes they don't make it explicit what kind of conception is operative. And that leads to a plethora of like contradictory findings. So for example, there's disagreement about how prevalent political conflict actually is, because there are some approaches that have a perception-based idea of political conflict. Whenever someone perceives there to be political conflict, then it is political conflict. Others have a more objective approach to that. There's also differences in opinion about whether conflict correlates positively or negatively with political participation, if it engages or activates citizens to become engaged in the political process. And it is also unclear whether it positively or negatively correlates with social fragmentation. So basically what I want to do in that first chapter is to say, well, what we need is more in-depth analyses of political conflict. And in order to gain that deeper understanding of political conflict, I do agree with conflict realists who say, well, we need to look at political conflict not from some sort of ideal realm, but actually at political conflict as it is experienced and practiced. So what political conflict is on a day-to-day basis for people. And that brings us then very close to phenomenology, as I argue. So this is where the shift to phenomenology happens, because I'm interested not so much in what political conflict is, but how it unfolds for political actors, what it means to them, and what we can learn from that experience. And so we return to the phenomena of political conflict, and we'll say a couple of things about classical phenomenology in a bit. But the idea is basically that through a better understanding of political conflict, we will also be able to provide more feasible solutions. And I'm thinking here, especially of conflict utopians, because I think that the kinds of principles that they formulate do not really track in the real world. And that might be an issue. Okay. On to the second chapter, which I'm really going to condense here down, and I'm only going to talk very briefly, hopefully very briefly, about it. So critical phenomenology is kind of a new game in town, and it is still very hotly debated what it actually is. It has been around, I just learned, for quite some time in anthropology. But in philosophy, the term critical phenomenology has been around maybe since 2013 and later. Okay, so first, what is classical phenomenology? And I suppose you all have some knowledge, or maybe a lot of knowledge, about what phenomenology or classical phenomenology is taken to be. I just want to maybe update you, or just maybe tell you how I understand it, so that we're on the same page, and then you can tell me why I'm wrong. So phenomenology basically asks the question of how it is possible that we make meaningful experiences precisely in the way that we do. So it's kind of a transcendental enterprise, talking about the conditions of possibility for something to appear as it does for us. And it does so because it is at heart a correlational approach to meaning. It says it's not a constructionist view of meaning, where the subject basically imbues the world with meaning one-sidedly. It's also not a realist attempt, or a scientist approach to meaning, where the world basically imposes its meaning on us. Did I say the world? Yeah, the world imposes its meaning on us. But meaning is something that comes about in the interplay between subject and world. And this unfolding of that interplay between subject and world is something that has a structured nature. Phenomenologists say that almost like it's rule guided, and we want to learn the rules. We want to learn these kinds of what they deem universal or transcendental structures of our experience, of our consciousness, and our relation of consciousness to the world. And this is why they are universal, these structures. They apply to all of us equally, except for maybe in some sort of pathological cases where that is ruptured. Although in the phenomenology of psychiatry, for example, it is now hotly debated whether these structures actually break down, or whether they just show themselves in a different way, right? And in order to get to these structures of experience, phenomenology does not only say, so we need to uncover these structures of experience, but phenomenology also says we need to go through experience to come to these structures. So what we need is to suspend our worldly commitments, our theoretical commitments, our common sense commitments, and really hone in on the object as it is experienced, on the phenomenon, describe it as detailed as possible from our first person perspective. And then through that, we kind of reach these transcendental structures. So critical phenomenology now says it does things at some points very differently. So I think the most important part is that critical phenomenology claims that it is working not on universal structures, so structures that are common to all of us, or that are the same for all of us, but it is interested in the quasi-transcendental, which is basically socio-material, historically grown socio-material structures. Structures of society that situate us differently, and that result in particularized life worlds, and life worlds that are different one from the other. And so what is meant by quasi-transcendental, we can hear, I think, Günther here, who's the one that said, made critical phenomenology in philosophy en vogue in 2013, says that the quasi-transcendental are these relatively stable but inert, or inert social meanings, but they are also kind of malleable institutions and practices that impinge upon our experience, that impinge upon our potential range of action, how we can go about our day. And second of all, critical phenomenology is just not interested in any social structures, but social structures of power. So critical phenomenology says these social structures situate us differently, and they do so in an unjust way. So the social structures that critical phenomenology is interested in are heteronormativity, white supremacy, ableism, capitalism, you could say as well, or any other oppressive social logic and system. I will skip over the third point here. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but I think one thing to still highlight that is very important is now that activist impetus. So critical phenomenology is not only interested in describing these quasi-transcendental structures and basically trying to come to terms with how these structures situate us differently, why we have different experiences of certain phenomena, but it also wants to change those. So it is, in a quasi-Marxist way, interested in not only interpreting the world, but changing it, a world that it deems as deeply unjust. So there's different readings of what critical phenomenology is supposed to be, or what it is supposed to do in the philosophical landscape. Some of them, of the more classical phenomenologists, say it's completely superfluous, because classical phenomenology is already a critical endeavor, and therefore we don't need critical phenomenology anymore. Some of them think that critical phenomenologists think that they are, if you want, reinventing the wheel and revolutionizing what phenomenology can or should be. And I would just say that it is an interdisciplinary project. I would just say it brings together classical, so transcendental phenomenology, interested in universal structures, but also critical theory broadly construed. And with that, I mean feminism, critical race theory, Foucauldian genealogy, maybe also Frankfurt School, although there's some definite compatibility issues if you ask Adorno. But nonetheless, critical phenomenology is then interested in both these universal structures and these quasi-transcendental structures of power. So what does that mean for my project? It means that two research questions, basically. So what kinds of universal structures need to be in place so that any agent, regardless of who they are, can experience a political conflict as a political conflict? And then I go on to talk about normativity, space, body. And also how are conflict participants situated differently in political conflict with respect to race, gender, class, and others. So, and the intersections of labor. So in what way are certain kinds of structures of power involved that turn the conflict field, if you will, into an asymmetrical one? And the political impetus is still the same, to effectuate or participate in effectuating social political change, and therefore critical phenomenology is not a purely academic practice. Okay, another aspect of this, critical phenomenology, at least according to Günther, should go beyond the first-person perspective. I mean, that makes sense. If I, for example, want to talk about heteronormativity, then, and I only include my first-person experience about that, then I might not really track certain kinds of important features, right? And therefore, we should go beyond the first-person perspective and also include second-person and third-person perspectives. And I think second-person perspective can then only mean we want to do it in a systematic way to engage in qualitative interviewing and other qualitative research methods. However, so far that doesn't really happen. And in the book and in a paper that I'm writing at the moment, I'm making the point that critical phenomenology shouldn't only and exclusively or always engage with qualitative research methods, but it should also include it in its methodological repertoire. And that is basically what I did in the book. So I have 13 in-depth semi-structured interviews that I did with political actors, ranging from politicians in state parliaments to activists and civil servants, peacekeepers. I devised an interview guide that was oriented towards both phenomenological notions and critical theoretical concepts. And the goal was to arrive at rich descriptions of experience. Those were then coded and grouped into categories, phenomenological categories, to arrive at both the universal and social structures that I've been talking about now for quite some time. And I interpreted that data with phenomenology, feminism, and critical philosophy of race, mainly, but also a little bit of disability studies and Frankfurt School. Okay, now actually talking about conflict. So the third chapter that I'm, at least that's planned, the third chapter of the book is going to talk about the kinds of normativities that we encounter in the political world and that make it basically possible that we experience political conflict as political conflict. So that's the idea. And so after discussing in detail past episodes of political conflict with my interviewees, I usually ask them at some point to summarize how they understood the phenomenon for themselves in general. So in what way had going through these experiences informed how they understood political conflict. And one of the most interesting answers was given by Thomas, who's a politician for a left-leaning party in Germany and also a member of the state parliament in Germany. And he said, I understand under conflict that I can be in a situation in which I'm very certain to be doing the right thing and having to do this thing. But at the same time, I am trapped because I know that not everyone will like that. I know that when I make a decision for a position that benefits one, but not the other, that I'm always in conflict with myself. And he here talks about the end of coal in his region and how he agrees with his party members that this needs to be done to battle climate change. But at the same time, his constituents have been living off of coal industry quite heavily. And so they're losing their livelihoods or their jobs at least. So, and what Thomas points to here for me is that there's some sort of internal mirroring of that exterior conflict event. So the kind of crossroads that conflict participants usually find themselves in, the interests that clash together, also clash in each individual. And so in this case, far from being only aware of his side of the conflict or of one or two sides of the conflict, Thomas experiences himself as being claimed by all sides of the conflict. And I think it would be very easy now to say, well, this is just a dilemma. So you are misrepresenting the case, Niclas, because this is simply a dilemma. And this is an internal conflict, but that has really then surpassed the conflict event itself that is interpersonal in nature. But I want to say that this is not just an accidental facet of Thomas's maybe idiosyncratic conflict experience, but it is actually structural to political conflict experience as a whole. And to do this, I drew on Irene McMullen's book, Existential Flourishing. Is anyone aware of that book? So that is basically a book where she brings in existential phenomenology to talk about virtue ethics and what makes a good life. And she says that in order to lead a good life, we need to be responsive to three kinds of reasons, three kinds of claims. In order to be responsive in the right way, we need the virtues. So I'm not going to talk about good life and virtues and excellence, but I'm going to draw on that to basically say that the fabric of the political world, so that fabric that draws me, links me to the political world, is itself deeply normative. So that is also for situations outside the political. When I go about my daily pursuits, when I go about my daily tasks, I am basically enticed, I'm being claimed by different reasons directed at me to act in one way or the other. And I think in the political world, we can have 7 kinds of claims here. And I'm going to go through them for the rest of the talk, I believe, another 12 minutes or so. Should be fine. So the most obvious one, I think, is thou claims or you claims of the second person, concrete others that give me reason to act in certain ways. And they can do that either by them communicating directly what they want from me, or they can do that via their sheer bodily presence, right? So when I have someone in front of me, they might want counsel from me, an open ear, a helping hand. They might also simply not want to be harmed by me, right? But then we also have what I call me claims, or what also Irene McMullen calls me claims. So these are first-person claims in the singular, which is the kinds of expectations that I level at myself by virtue of the person that I am or want to become. So if I understand myself as a teacher, I expect myself to comport myself towards students in one way or the other, right? To be attentive to their needs, to prepare their teaching material properly, and all these kinds of things, right? As a friend, I want to be a good friend, and this comes with certain kinds of expectations, with certain kinds of norms that are operative there. As a politician, I might want to bring my vision to the world, and that means that I might have to fight for political office. Right, so this is kind of what I expect of myself as a politician, that I take responsibility, that I seek out office to represent me or others. But the problem is here, and this is like a rudimentary kind of political conflict that we can have, there might be another concrete person who also wants the same job, right? And so we compete for the same job, and I have to kind of weigh my claim to that political office with the other or against the other. So I think we can describe a couple of political conflicts in that way already, but in the end, I think it is important to pluralize these situations. And so we arrive at we claims and thou claims. We claims are the kinds of reasons that I have for acting in certain ways that stem from my belongingness to a collective. So that stem from me belonging to a political party, to a movement, to an interest group, or maybe even belonging to a family, and that creates certain kinds of projects that I do not only pursue by myself, but that I share with others. And those give me reasons to comport myself in certain ways. And the same then holds for the other case, thou claims of the second person plural. So a Tory member and a Labour member enter a bar, enter a pub, and sit down and talk about policies, right? And when they talk about policies, they do not only talk about what they personally think is the right way to go about the economy, to lower taxes, for example, or to maybe increase taxes, but they actually talk as representatives of their collectives, of the kind of party that they belong to. And so reducing these kinds of situations to just two individuals talking wouldn't really appreciate how collectives are already present in that situation. And I think it is then also, because I think some theorists would basically leave it at that first personal and second personal, but I think it is also important to include the third personal both in the singular and plural, so he, she, they, or any other pronoun by which a person wants to be called, and they claims in the plural, namely of concrete others that are not present in the situation. And I think it is very important to appreciate that phenomenality, because some people would want to say maybe, well, in my mind, I'm turning to that person, and so I'm engaging them in a second person perspectival way. That's, I think, the same people who say that they are in a dialogue with Aristotle when they read the Nicomachean Ethics or so. I think that doesn't appreciate that Aristotle doesn't really talk back when I try to talk to him, right? So we have these third person claims that come from concrete others not present in the situation. And apart from my little excursus to Aristotle, I think it is also politically relevant, because think of, for example, members of parliament who are part of a parliament where certain marginalized groups are not represented. So I'm thinking of, for example, non-binary people and trans persons. There's one person who identifies as trans in German national parliament. There are some state parliaments where that doesn't, where people who identify as trans are not present at all. Nonetheless, I think that these parliamentarians can experience themselves as beholden to reasons or claims that are being directed at them from people who are not present in that situation. And they don't experience themselves as being beholden to them in a second person perspective, but also not in a first person plural perspective. These are not, I'm not part of that group, but nonetheless, they give me reason to act in one way or another, to acknowledge them in one way or another. So what then political conflict is, in my eyes, is a situation in which this kind of plural normativity of the political world manifests. So this is a structural thing. So the plural normativity is there if I'm aware of it or not, which I think is also something that I can explain why I, for example, as a man, wasn't always aware that the fights that I was having with a partner were going along gendered lines, were actually political, right? Because I wasn't attuned to there being actually political reasons and kind of pluralized reasons in this situation when I thought it was just the two of us. It was just an interpersonal exchange, right? So I do not always have to be aware of that, but I think in a political conflict, this kind of structure becomes particularly manifest and becomes transparent, relieves itself of its transparency, and is a situation in which I need to skillfully adjudicate between those claims. And I can fail in that. I can also succeed in that. But the kinds of, I don't want to be a realist here and say that it's always one right solution to a certain constellation, right? But we do have a grasp of this being a situation in which I can fail, in which I can end up short of my own expectations. So what to do now? Okay, 5 minutes, I think I can do that in 5 minutes. So what to do now about these kinds of constellations, right? And I think it's very easy to say, well, what we should do is to refer to some sort of norm here, right? When I am faced with a situation in which a me claim, a thou claim, and a we claim is at stake, then there is a norm operative that I can draw on to find a solution, which of these claims to give more weight or less weight. But I think the issue is that if we take up these norms or principles in a rather passive way, then we do not really take responsibility for these principles, and we do so in a rather impersonal way. So this norm doesn't really belong to me, it doesn't really belong to the other. It is something that we just draw on because this is what we do. It's just what one does, if you will. And I think that leads us to Heidegger's Das Man, or the anyone or the one. At least this is how I decode these kinds of moments where we draw on such norms. And I have here a passage of Heidegger's Being in Time, where he says, where he talks about Das Man, about the one, where he says, we enjoy ourselves and have fun the way one enjoys oneself. We read, see, and judge literature and art the way one sees and judges, but we also withdraw from the great mass the way one withdraws. We find shocking what one finds shocking, and so on. So what I think we have here is not only just norms for behavior, but actually norms for appropriate or adequate or normal ways of not only acting, but judging and seeing and even feeling. And what this is, I think, is nothing but another sort of claim that is being laid upon us. When we refer to business as usual, what we are doing is adhering to a claim or following a claim to do as one does. And so we have a seventh form of normativity in political conflict, which is these impersonal claims that don't really belong to anyone, right? We don't really take responsibility for, but that are somehow supposed to guide us. And I think impersonal norms, when they are norms of behavior or like political norms, political principles, are norms that we can draw on to mediate between the other 6 types of claims, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are neutral. And this is, I think, where we enter the critical side of the critical phenomenological work here, because these impersonal claims exert their own normative force. And I think they can become problematic when these impersonal norms form part of exactly those kinds of social structures of power that critical phenomenology is interested in. And I mean that in, so one side of what I mean here is that we are led to systematically, because of these norms being adjudicating asymmetrically in situations of conflict, they lead us to systematically prioritize one kind of claim over the other. For example, the claims of white people, like me claims, right, over the claims of Black persons or gender minorities. And the second way that these kinds of impersonal claims might be problematic is when they do not only tell us what to do, but actually what to see and what not to see. So they might actually render me completely unaware of the existence of particular kinds of claims in a situation, be they second personal or third personal. So I think I will end it there. So basically the other chapters highlight, for example, like the conflict space, highlight the spatial elements of these kinds of events, of conflict events. In the subsequent chapter, we focus on the body and the bodily dimension. But in both cases, it is also always about bringing about, working out why these kinds of impersonal norms are not innocuous, are not just simply neutral, but do have an effect that situates us asymmetrically, and that situates us asymmetrically because one way of seeing is dominant over the other. So it's a matter of power, what kinds of norms are operative in a situation and what are not. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Niclas. We've got plenty of time for questions and discussions. So if you're online, you can either raise your hand and speak, or you're welcome to just type your question in the chat. And then if you're in the room, just raise your hand. Rosie, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Niclas. I'm not a philosopher, as you know, I'm an anthropologist. So I really enjoyed that. But one thing that really struck me with your kind of final, or really last but one slide with the 7 claims is the word claim.
Yeah.
I'm sure this is maybe stands out less to philosophical ears. But can you tell me more about claim? Because I was reading that list of 7 and thinking how different it would sound with the word need, like I needs, as opposed to I claims. It kind of seems like always kind of has a neutralizing effect on the potency of requirements under conflict if they're seen as claims. But I'm not sure if I should be reading claims as truth claims that are falsifiable, or as claims on like legitimate claims on an estate, like demands or requirements.
Yeah, thank you. So, I didn't have that in the presentation now, but I was heavily influenced by a phenomenologist called Bernard Weidenfels, who has a responsive take on ethics, which basically in his terms mean that we, in any kind of situation, are always drawn or always called to by other agents or other aspects of our life world. And so they attempt to claim me, I would say, right? But I can always refuse to hear that call, to follow that call.
Yeah.
And I think that can then manifest in as being voiced as a need or a want or a desire. It's
completely different from the way I was reading this as an because I'm reading it as though people arrive with a claim.
Yeah, no.
And in fact, what it's the exact opposite that you're saying is
it's just that bringing itself to my attention.
Yeah.
Bringing itself to my attention.
A call.
It's a call, yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is, and that is why I like Weidenfels so much, and I think this is what I also want to be operative in that account of political conflict. As much as I'm an agent in political conflict, I'm also a patient. There's a pathos involved. I cannot help but be claimed by others. And I can attempt, so Weidenfels talks about it in terms of the alien, my own sphere, and then the alien sphere, or the other who's radically alien sometimes, or an experience that is radically alien. And I can try to shut that out, or I can try to make that my own to occupy that space with my own meanings, right? But in any way or shape or form of how I go about it, I will always have this being addressed, and that I can't get out. Even like a conflict agitator who just wants to stir up, chaos, cannot help but be affected by the gazes of others in that situation. And that conflict agitator can also fail to properly recognize that these are even present. What I tried in my wonky way to say about, my fights with a partner, right? When I'm just not aware of this something like this going along gendered lines, and it's just not something innocuous that I'm fighting about right now. That is basically what I meant with claim.
Thanks, that helps a lot.
Thank you.
Lucy, could you show the chat, please?
Yes.
Then Niclas might be able to read the question as well. There's a couple of comments and questions in the chat. I'll alternate between the room and the chat and the online space. So here we go. Oh, you can see it on your own computer. So Fidel's question is, I would like to invite some comment about the potential distinction between a personal phenomenology of conflict and a collective phenomenology of conflict. In particular, I'm interested in how the individual changes due to crowd behavior where some may not recognize themselves in times of conflict. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a way that being with others and being maybe in great crowds can have I don't know what the word in English is for that, de-individualizing effect. Is it that? That I feel myself as being part of one big mass. I suppose that this can also mean that I am able to become unaware of my own needs and my own first person perspective. Also, by the way, I didn't talk about ideology, which I think is also something that I should address. But let me read that again. Yeah, I think this, in a way, I suppose that there are certain situations which can also be very dangerous, thinking of mass demonstrations or mass panic or situations like that, where these events result out of mass panics, no. But certain kinds of situations where we completely give up ourselves to the collective or to that collective experience, and therefore might also completely drown out any other sort of claim and only think of or only perceive of the situation as one big we claim, which might be very dangerous. But I have to think about that more, and I find that very interesting. Thank you very much.
Giovanna, did you have the other?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. As someone who doesn't know anything really about this, I thought this was really useful. The way you mapped out the debate were very clear. So thank you so much. I also, however, I mean, maybe as someone who doesn't know anything, I can ask you rather bluntly. So I was trying to think about your proposal of the seven points, and it's like, but very naively. So how is this? Are you just saying that basically? Oh yeah, I mean, conflict is the acknowledgement that people have different perspectives, and I need to negotiate, adjudicate between them. You did mention at the beginning, maybe I will tell you more about my view is not just about epistemic disagreement. So I don't know if that question kind of touches on that, but maybe it is important to say what you're saying if my naive rendition is kind of plausible, maybe it is worth saying it. I just don't know.
Yeah.
But what? Yeah, is this is it unfair to just say, well, you're just saying, well, look, these people have all different perspective, and it's me and the other, but there's all other groups and they, and we need to figure out.
Well, I think in a way, yeah, you're right. I think also it's so the thing with making things explicit that seem obvious to us is that this might help having a better idea of something that becomes transparent over time, and that we just never think about it again. And I think this is kind of what I meant with descriptive adequacy that is important for normative adequacy, because as I mentioned at the beginning a little bit, conflict utopians have a tendency to limit the political space, like the space of legitimate exchange of reasons to that, I think, first person plural, right? So these should be claims that are in principle at least shareable by everyone, right? So Rawls has this idea of, for example, public and non-public reasons, and non-public reasons that are nonetheless about political issues. That is something that we can debate in the background society, so in civil society basically. But when it comes to the real political decisions, then we should really just focus on public reasons, on weak claims, in the way that I understand that. And I think this is a normative claim, but in the way that it is set up, it is also descriptively adequate. And I think therefore, roles and conflict utopians are sometimes not really equipped to address the complexity of certain kinds of conflict situations. Because if I say, well, there's all these different kinds of claims, and then the conflict utopian goes on to say, well, yeah, but the ones that really count are the weak claims. Well, why is that, right? I would actually urge that these are all incommensurable kinds of claims. They kind of affect one another. They have, I can be informed by weak claims that can do something for my weak claims because I understand myself as a person differently, right? I certainly always draw on impersonal claims because the kinds of norms operative in society or the social understandings operative in society will have a bearing on how I understand myself, right? But these are nonetheless relatively distinct kinds of normativities that we have to keep in mind if we do not want to bastardize what is happening in politics. Another example, conflict totalizers have a tendency to just talk about in the us versus them, which is basically just meaning us versus you, right? So they only talk of we claims and thou claims in the plural. And that also ignores how kind of forgets the individual in political conflict and forgets concrete individuals. And also, I think does not fully appreciate, again, like the kind of complexity. And then we can, I think, once we have that right, I think we can talk about normative solutions. And I'm getting towards that in the 6th chapter that I'm not, didn't talk about today.
Can I ask a follow-up? Because that helps. But also I was intrigued by the fact that you conducted interviews, because also maybe what I was grasping after is a rich description of the phenomenology of conflict, which, as you were answering, you seem to, that seemed like really interesting. And that's where they say the meat comes. And when you present this very general claim about, conflict of claims, then it becomes too abstract and in a sense also non-phenomenological. Yeah. I was wondering whether your book will also include a bit more in terms of what it is to experience this conflict in terms of all these claims, because that seems really enriching.
Yeah, it's much richer in descriptions. There's a lot more statements from interviewees. I also contrast that with political ontologies of Hannah Arendt, for example, Chantal Mouffe, Jacques Rancière, Paul Ricoeur. So it's both on the theoretical level, it's more complex than I made it out to be, and it's also going to have like the empirical base. But for what I'm doing here today, I thought I'd better keep it as straightforward as possible. But maybe I should include more quotes.
Thank you. And there's another question from Lucia in the chat. She says, I know there was not enough time to fully address this in the presentation, but I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit about how you address the body and conflict.
Yeah, thank you. So in that chapter, I work especially with Black feminism and Black critical philosophy of race and decolonial works of Frantz Fanon is one author. In contrast, these are George Yancey, Lewis Gordon, sorry. And I contrast that with Merleau-Ponty and Alfred Schütz. The idea is that on the one side, the body carries the history of a conflict, because through our body schema, we take up meanings, past meanings of our social environment. And that basically makes us see particular instances of political conflict events in a particular way and also act in them in a particular way. But also there's this body as object side of things where we perceive the other. So it's not only my body going into the conflict with a certain constellation configuration, it's also the other being perceived in certain ways. And there I work with Schütz and the notion of typification or types. And while Schütz sometimes seems to say that they are, again, I mean, he's not a political sociologist, so I shouldn't expect him to be particularly aware of certain things, but it sometimes seems a bit neutral what he's saying. He's also highlighting or underlining that, well, what is more primordial, or what is a higher priority, is always that concrete encounter of the other, where my types are then, or my typificatory scheme is then actualized and changed in accordance with the uniqueness of the other person. And I kind of want to, with Black feminism and critical philosophy of race, I want to turn that a little bit upside down to say, well, there are situations in which type trumps uniqueness. And that happens especially in for example, racialized kinds of conflicts, where I see the other as, and talking about the different sorts of claims, I don't really see the thou claim of the other person anymore. In the singular, I just see a particularized, racialized thou claim in the plural. This is a representative of another group, and that might be problematic because we cannot, again, appreciate the complexity of the phenomenon. I think that political typology is, typification is also something more or less structural, so it happens all the time anyway, but it might become, in a way, and it can happen also without, bodily markers necessarily, just by virtue of what the person says. And okay, that's a Tory, and that will actualize and change my situation. But I think it can become some sort of pathological, and I work on that again with the statements of my interviewees to bring that out in the case of racialized conflict.
I really want to ask you.
I hope that answered the question.
Lucia, do you want to say anything? I know you're there. No.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this, and I learned lots from your kind of sketching of various kind of political phenomenologies as well as, but I guess so that I very strongly agreed with your point at the beginning that we need a better description and typology of political conflict, and then I was quite attracted by your claims and things at the end as sort of ways of thinking about kind of, or analysing conduct and kind of ethics and so on. But I wanted to kind of get back to that description, because I do wonder whether the pictures you showed at the beginning, for example, so is it helpful to think of the January insurrection, a debate in a local, the Landers, whatever, about whether or not we should close mines, or whether or not we should close mines with or without giving everybody better jobs, or and the various different kind of is it helpful to put them all under the heading of political conflict? Particularly when conflict seems a very kind of neutral term, it's just and a way of equalizing somehow. Well, these people, we've all got political disagreements, just part of life. And the fact that some people, so I just kind of worry, I was wondering whether you actually had a kind of typology that, or in terms of thinking about the descriptions in a more.
So thank you. I see that problem. So I think that kind of plural, like this structure of a plural normativity that is operative. In any case, I think that when it comes to more fine-grained typologies to distinguish between, for example, a disagreement and a protest and an insurrection attempt, I think then in a way also we can talk about the configuration of how these claims are dealt with and how they appear. And I think then, however, I'm also I'm not enough of a purist to then insist on phenomenology having to do that work. So I think then this is where sociology, for example, is helpful, and peace and conflict studies and others. So something that struck me really, and I might have gotten the wrong idea of peace and conflict studies, because I did my PhD at Essex, and then has a very good center for peace and conflict studies. But they do mostly empirical and quantitative work, and I think this is then I think this is not the kind of empirical work that would interest me then. I think it's more interesting than to see again the quality of how people go through these kinds of experiences. And yeah, I think I would need more sociologically rich taxonomies for that. But I'm not sure if I can offer that in that book.
No, I mean, some of it's not just, I mean, some of it is a kind of insurrection is quite, well, breaking the rule, a sort of rule breaking, overthrowing or a kind of power grab is different from a dispute within rule. I mean, there are other things apart from sociology that would.
Yeah, sure, no, definitely.
And yeah.
And I'm also so I would say that we can put this under political conflict, but that might be a terminological disagreement that we have. I do agree that we need to be aware of the differences between these occurrences. I also believe that so because I'm doing this work now in the online context, for example, and I am there, for example, reaching kind of the limits of calling certain things political conflict, because, for example, a shitstorm in a common thread on Facebook, calling that political conflict gets very tricky, because there's almost no real interactive moment anymore at some point, right? So I am aware that there have to be limitations. I wouldn't necessarily say that I would, so for example, say a disagreement is a particular form of conflict experience that we undergo. It's the one where there's not necessarily a violent element in it, for example.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yes. Oh, I should make a loud noise. Yeah. As an international student, the publish is a long history and the big topic, but infecting the politician is the main normal and the main trait. So as a student or common people, what can we do to survive the issues about politicians?
That's a very good question. I am afraid I don't really have a ready-made answer for.
Okay.
And it's also, I don't want to be lazy here, right? I don't want to say, well, I'm a philosopher, I don't have to. So that's not what I'm saying. But I think so. So the kind of the last chapter that I want to go to, right, is basically, and this might make things even worse with respect to, well, am I just stating the obvious here, right? So what I want to get at is basically a model that towards conflict that is a bit more dynamic than the other approaches might sometimes seem to suggest. So instead of always striving for consensus, we can also strive for compromise sometimes, right? I also think, and this is the critical theoretical aspect, we don't always have to find an agreement. I think sometimes it is important not to agree to certain settings or certain solutions, propositions. But I think, and that is maybe also coming back to the previous question, I think our the way that we always think always to know the other, right, in a conflict. Oh, this is a Tory, and now I have, typification goes on, and I go, oh, I know exactly who that person is, right? Forestalls a deeper sense of what a conflict is, what kinds of claims can be at stake, and also it forestalls potential for communal learning. And so what I want to get at, in particularly intractable kinds of conflict, where it seems that really there are different understandings not only of the conflict or the solutions to the conflict in place, but actually of the conflict and of the other people. Like there's a complete mismatch between how we perceive the world. What we need to engage is a sort of communal learning process where we, and there I work with Merleau-Ponty's lateral universal and his stuff in the visible and the invisible, that we kind of have to be put each other's world to the test, each other's worlds to the test in like an open dialogue, where we don't have to find a solution immediately. We don't always need to like readily find a solution. Right? I agree that this is hard in terms of climate change, like we don't have time, right? But in other things, I believe we need to, train ourselves in what George Yancey calls, I think, radical listening. And what Matthew Radcliffe calls radical empathy, trying to understand a life world that is not necessarily mine. And I don't want to be a centrist in that regard. And that means that I think these kinds of encounters have to be structured in a way that especially those voices that were drowned out in the past have take center stage first. So as someone like me, I think I have to like sit down and listen for a bit, which is ironic because I'm talking a little bit. But I think this is, I think this would be for some of these intractable conflicts, at least it would be a step in the right direction.
There's a couple of comments in the chat, and I don't know if the people, Theo, who wrote the comment, wants to speak. But you can see it there, right? So question at the end of the comment is, how can we foster constructive dissonances in public political spaces? And what are your thoughts on dissonance?
But the
That's Theo Richardson Gould. Reminds him of Adorno's concept of
okay. There we go. That's the, I couldn't find the word dissonance. So I really like, thanks Theo, I really like that you bring Adorno to the picture and his negative dialectics. And I'd like to talk to you about this because I once made the very steep claim that what Adorno is doing in the negative dialectics is very similar to what Merleau-Ponty does in the visible and the invisible. We might disagree on that, but I think that is something that Peter Deuce also subscribed to a certain point. Should it be encouraged in the public realm as a way to observe bias, question assumption, and review study, much like how phenomenology bring? Yes. So I think we need more public spaces is one part of that. So I think the privatization of public space is an issue. And one of my doctoral supervisors, Jörg Schaub, actually works on the book at the moment on aesthetic freedom, which works not in the phenomenological register, but he has a paper out on that, and I highly recommend that paper, which works in the in Honnett's register of the different types of freedom that we should have in society, and that the absence of which constitutes a lack of recognition of our contribution to society or as moral agents. And he says, well, moral freedom, for example, and legal freedom do not really capture what he means by aesthetic freedom, which is the freedom to challenge prevalent norms in society or dominant norms in society and role images of who we should be, like identities and so on and so forth. So, and I think that communicates quite fruitfully with what I'm aiming at. So maybe what we need is more aesthetic freedom. I just see in your question that you also speak of aesthetic truth. So, and I think how to institutionalize aesthetic freedom, Jörg, is very much on the fence of institutionalizing that, because aesthetic freedom is like the freedom to free play. And it seems that coming up with too many norms for that would be an issue. But giving space to that both metaphorically and actually very much literally would be a good first step in that direction. And then we come to education. Maybe we shouldn't always grade students. I mean, we shouldn't only focus on STEM, but yeah, that's also a rambling answer for complicated issues.
Helen?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, really enjoyed that. I had a question again back to the 7 claims, just how, like whether you theorized how we might move through different ones at different times and like, because it kind of brought to mind how when you kind of have a political belief, you often have this idea that like there's a group of people like you saying like, oh, you're a Tory, so therefore I know what you believe. As soon as then you're face to face and you're in a you claim or thou claim with the Tory, you suddenly like, oh, that's actually completely different, and like you're in more of a discussion. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering like how theorizing the he, she, they claims as thou claims, or even inversely, might be used to either like increase conflict or even resolve conflict.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I would say it helps to sometimes try to check your ideas of what a claim might be by actually talking to that person, right? I think it happens not so often because we are maybe naturally, maybe not conflict avoiders. So we are on the fence of actually bringing ourselves into the position of talking to Tory, right? I mean, I actually know Tories, and I also know Brexiteers, and I maybe because of who I am, there's not so much at stake for me to talking to the Tory, right? So that is also something that I try to be aware of, that I understand why people refuse conversations with hard right-wing persons, right? To put it mildly, because for them, much is at stake. Like if your right to exist is denied, then I don't really see why you should be the person who opens dialogue with them, right? Yeah, so this speaks to a certain sense of vulnerability and risk when you try to turn he, she, they claim into a thou claim, right? But I think, yeah, I think this can help in resolving conflicts. I also think that is what I meant with political typification, right? When these types are very strong, when your typificatory scheme is very robust and very inflexible, it might actually not help. And there is who was the Allport was I think a conflict researcher who basically said, what we need is we put them all in a room, right? And that was apparently horrible. That didn't help at all. So I interviewed for the PhD and for the book, I interviewed peacekeepers who operate in Northern Ireland, and they work with a researcher at Queen's University in Belfast, and I forgot that I don't have it. Not even on the tip of my tongue, but it's something like no, I'm not going to try to find a word, but what they basically do, they have a very particular way of bringing two groups, so Protestant and Catholic side, right, or Republican and Loyalist side together. So people who are from villages right next to each other who haven't spoken in decades, basically, right? And what they do with them is not put them all in a room, let's see what happens, right? And close the door and lock the door maybe. But what they do is they go in several steps, and only along the line, very much at the end of this route, they bring these people together. Before that, they have already exchanged like little snippets, like little notes. So they enter the same room, but they don't enter it at the same time, and they leave information about themselves. So they are reminded of their joint humanity, basically, before they see each other in actuality. Because then these political types might just be too strong, and they might just, see each other. You're just, an IRA person, So again, rambling answer, but saying it can be both, but it depends on the technique then.
Yeah. Thank you.
We've only got 10 minutes, but there's actually 3 kind of substantial questions in the chat. And I don't know if you want to read through them and and try and answer them all in like one sweeping. If they're all too.
Where do we start?
So okay, we start with
Is Georg?
Georg, and then there's Jonas, and then Lucia again. And I think
Okay, if I understand the first, so I do. Okay, what about first class politics being chronological as well? So I do make a difference between the political and politics. This is the kind of political ontology, the debate, the discussion of political ontology that I bring into exactly this third chapter. The kind of position that I have on these political ontologies is that they do get something right, because they do get something right about how the political space is constituted, but they overemphasize certain kinds of claims over others. So Arendt, for example, depending on if you speak to the when she's called the elitist Arendt, right, of the human condition, where it seems like she's only talking about first personal singular and second personal singular claims, and not about the pluralized forms, or if you talk about the communicative Arendt, where she seems to be only talking about we claims. So it seems that sometimes she's missing other dimensions. Talking about us versus them, or we versus thou. So also seems a bit underappreciating the complexity. So I do talk about these things. But I think that in their eyes, or at least the way that the debate or this ontological difference is framed in the debate on the political is kind of an ontological dimension. So it's not something that we can talk ontically about. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that there are political conflicts and political conflicts in a way. And are there not examples possible where there is more at stake than asymmetry in power, and speaking with Weidenfeld's a more radical political pathos before we try to work stuff out? Yeah, Weidenfeld has the distinction between conflicts within an order and conflicts between orders. So like revolution is a sort of conflict where one order is breaking down and another one is instituted. So maybe is that something, I suppose this is like you talking about the second kind of conflict. And I do believe that these are phenomena that we can talk about and should be talking about. I think that then at least this kind of plural normativity is still given. I think it's hard for me to envision a war or a revolution or so where there isn't an asymmetry involved. But I would have to talk to you in person, I think, to probably understand your question. But thank you. Also happy to take any, like, if anybody wants to send me emails also, or have a Zoom meeting, please let me know. Get in touch. Thank you for a very timely presentation. I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. Thank you. And hi to Helsinki. I'm trying to formulate a vague thought here. I was wondering, since you showed the image of the House of Commons as a political complex space, we are often seeking to adjudicate between conflicting normative claims and make good on them, but sometimes we are also out to win, for example, in elections. How do you approach the, let's call it Machiavellian concern, with winning and keeping power as one aspect of politics and political conflict alongside normative conflicts? Well, I think these kinds of conflicts for power, for these kinds of conflicts of power, we have guardrails in place, hopefully, right? So as you said, you mentioned elections. So we want to win an election. We have our we claims and they have their thou claims, and we don't necessarily need to resolve those. So come together to come to a consensus which of these claims are the better ones, but we basically agree that there is a higher procedure in place that can help us collectively channel these claims and adjudicate between them. So I would say in these kinds of situations where we refer or defer to decision principles, we are agreeing on, and quite passively oftentimes, on these kinds of norms that I was talking about, these kind of impersonal norms that can help us adjudicate between conflicts. And there, I think we would still have the idea that we got it right because we reflect the will of the people, for example, or the procedure is just, or something like that. If there are no such guardrails in place, then we can still fight out we and their claims without trying to find some sort of common bridge between the two, or without agreeing on the unforced force of the better argument. But more often than not, I think we then thereby, like, if it's really just a fight for power and a real struggle, maybe with violence involved, then we again do not appreciate the kinds of claims that are leveled by us at us by the concrete others and their bodies. Like the Levinasian point of thou shalt not kill, I think, are then disrespected. Yeah, my rambling 2 cents about that. And then is that Lucia? Is that the or Lucia? Is that? I have another one. Do you think this critical phenomenology approach to conflict should also contribute to a similar approach to reconciliation, or do you think a similar approach could be taken to reconciliation? Because also how reconciliation is conceptualized depends heavily on how conflict is conceptualized. Sorry, as in how reconciliation is done, experienced, not what is, more the how, not what. Yeah, I mean, reconciliation is basically the phase after, oftentimes when a conflict is ripe, I think it is called in conflict studies, when both sides realize that a conflict is hurting them. They're at a hurtful stalemate and they try to move beyond that kind of conflict. And then they enter the reconciliatory phase, or a conflict has been ended in a way, and then we enter the reconciliatory phase. I think depending on how the conflict was ended, these kinds of claims are still there. Of the other, and so reconciliation can definitely be guided by a critical phenomenology that is attuned to bringing out different kinds of claims that might otherwise not be heard or might otherwise be drowned out. And then, am I right that Theo is the?
I think Theo was just commenting on your answer to his previous question.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's a
okay.
response to his previous comment.
Okay, great.
As is that one.
Yes.
Yeah, so
some
Zoom's doing a weird thing where they're showing the original comment again with the response.
Yeah.
That's very academic, right? The first have to quote. But that's very good. Can I somehow get the comments?
Yes,
Yeah?
yeah,
Okay, great.
update the chat.
Yeah, thanks all. That was very helpful.
Yeah, well, and I think we're 3 minutes away from 2:30, so we can close here and just join me in thanking again Niclas for his talk. And
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There's probably still tea and coffee in the